Hello, my name is Kosta Milkov, and today I'm going to talk on the topic of the theological and practical relevance of evangelical witness within Eastern Orthodox context. All Christian churches that accept the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed trace their origin to the New Testament, and more specifically to the book of Acts, where we have the description of the birth of the church. The Eastern Orthodox Church puts a strong emphasis on this event and makes it a case in point for its decentralized principle of ecclesial organization, committed to principle of decision-making not via certain central authority, but via the assembly of the believers with the aid and guidance of the Holy Spirit. The necessity for structure and leadership are not so much divine precept, but a response to Christianity's explosive expansion in the Roman Empire. What was established in the earliest congregational and pastoral instructions in the New Testament is the backbone of Eastern Orthodox configuration. This consists of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Very important part of that plays Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, Nicaea, the very first ecumenical council, and the legacy of Nicaea. For example, take Athanasius of Alexandria, who played a key role in the most crucial development of the church after it was granted legitimacy by the Emperor Constantine. At what will become the first ecumenical council, in Nicaea at 325, it was decided about the divinity of Christ, and Nicaea and the six councils that followed through the 8th century are considered formative for the Eastern Orthodox theology. For Eastern Orthodox theologians, the doctrine of the Trinity, the divine human nature of Christ, naming Mary a God-bearer, a Theotokos, and the veneration of icons are of paramount importance, as all of these have been confirmed by consensus of bishops at a given council. Besides these conciliar dogmas, the Eastern Orthodox theology has a distinct anthropology and soteriology, as there has never been dispute concerning human free will and its role in accepting or rejecting of God's salvific grace. The Eastern Orthodox has never entertained the idea of original guilt in addition to the original sin. Sin, according to Eastern Orthodox teaching, brought death and corruption, but it did not make all future generations guilty for it. People are therefore born as mortal and corruptible, which makes them indefensible to sin, but they retain their freedom to accept God's victory over it on their behalf or to side with the devil in rebellion against God. Salvation is then not so much a legal release from guilt, a substitutionary death of Christ, but rather a healing enhancement of the corruptible human nature. Christ's incarnation is not only crucial for this death in the cross, but it is even more crucial that it meant Christ uniting with all humanity. All of those who belong to the church, beginning with their baptism, are united to Christ's perfect human nature, and through this unity are invited to grow into the journey of theosis, or divinization. This is a most distinctive teaching of Eastern Orthodox theology. In summary, it means that a follower of Christ participates in the uncreated divine energies and becomes divine. On this basis, further on, the Eastern Orthodox theology has also developed a so-called ecclesial hierarchy. In a nutshell, the Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology consists of a congregation of believers presided with a local bishop, assisted with presbyters or priests and deacons. As such, each local eparchy or diocese represents the whole universal church. Thus, the family of Eastern Orthodox churches, headed by a patriarch or an archbishop, are fully independent and self-governing, or as they call, autocephalous. The Patriarch of Constantinople, today's Istanbul, has an honorary primacy, but unlike the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, he's the first among equals. Having this in mind, we also need to remember that the church building in the Eastern Orthodox theology plays as important role as its own theology. The architecture of the Eastern Orthodox church building is first of all guided by theology. Every and each part represents the celestial reality which is present within the congregation of believers during the liturgy. The most representative aspect is the iconostasis that separates the sanctuary and always facing east and allowed only to priests, and the nave where the worshippers stand. The central dome usually features a fresco of Christ, the Pantocrator, or ruler of all universe, which is the most poignant feature of the idea of the church as a paradigm of heaven on earth, since Christ is both divine and human. Icons are an inalienable part of Eastern Orthodox spirituality and liturgical participation, and they convey three distinct features. They are material symbols of spiritual reality, they are venerated and not worshipped, and the persons they depict are saints who have attained theosis or divinizations. Icons are a physical reminder of the consecration of the whole creation when Christ took created matter upon himself. As St. John Damascene wrote in defense of icon venerations, open quote, "I do not worship matter, I worship the God of matter who became matter for my sake and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter." Close quotes. Tradition and worldview. The tradition in the Eastern Orthodox Church or Eastern Orthodox theology is based on the concept of tradition, or as they call it, paradosis, something that has been given to us by our forefathers. And it's rooted in study of patristics and scripture. Byzantine theology consciously seeks to integrate previous insights. Take, for example, Basil the Great, who lived between 330 and 379. When he was writing on the Holy Spirit and disputing with those who were against the acceptance of the divinity of the Spirit, he would write, open quotes, "We do not content ourselves with what was reported in Acts and in the epistles and in the Gospels, but both before and after reading them, we add other doctrines received from oral teaching and carrying much weight in the mystery of the faith." From here, the Eastern Orthodox theology developed something which is called a theocentric anthropology known as theosis. This is a teaching which is in many ways about salvation, about hamartiology, and about soteriology, but is embedded in the doctrine of God, ontology, and also in the doctrine of creation or cosmology. A very important figure about this particular feature is Maximus the Confessor, who lived in the best part of the 7th century. In one of his most seminal works called Ambigua, in the same way in which the soul and the body are united, according to Maximus, God should become accessible for participation by the soul, and through the soul, intermediary by the body, in order that the soul might receive an unchanging character and the body immortality, and finally that the whole man should become God. Divinized by the grace of God, became man, becoming whole man, soul and body by nature, and becoming whole God, soul and body by grace. This is a summary, really, of what, in a very extensive body of works, Maximus the Confessor has taught in the 7th century, and it has become a very, very important part of the development of Eastern Orthodox theology. A very important and prominent feature in Eastern Orthodox theology is the teaching about the Mother of God, Mary, or as they call it, Theotokos, or the God-bearer. Western Church venerates Mary as the ever-virgin Mother of God. By Western, here I really mean the Roman Catholic. The Eastern Church focuses, through the title Theotokos, on how her humanity expresses that of Christ, who is also divine. Take, for example, Gregory of Nazianzus, who lived in the best part of the 4th century. He states, open quotes, "If anyone does not confess that the Virgin Mary is Theotokos, he is found to be far from God. Whoever maintains that Christ passed through the Virgin as through a channel and was not fashioned in her in a manner as the same time human and divine, is likewise godless." Close quotes. From here, we go into the field of praxis and theoria, two very important features of Eastern Orthodox Church, which is basically how the practical aspect of life affects the more theoretical aspect of life and vice versa. For that, we will start with Evagrius of Pontus, who also lived in the second half of the 4th century. He wrote on prayer, he wrote on the unknowability of God, And when we see him, how he was teaching on all of these basic understandings of what he thought the early Christianity should have understand as a basics of Christian thought, later throughout history, he has been disputed and even together with Origen pronounced heretical. However, some of his teaching has been very, very important and influential for the development in general of Christianity, spirituality, but especially Eastern Orthodox theology. Another person close within the time and the region where Evagrius of Pontus comes from is Gregory of Nyssa, who diverges from the Neoplatonic concepts of the incomprehensibility of God, for which both Origen and Evagrius are accused of, but that is very disputable. And he says, having by the action of the Spirit passed through the whole of the hypercosmic city, having failed to recognize the one he desires among intelligible and incorporeal beings, and abandoning all that he finds, he recognizes the one he is seeking as the only one he does not comprehend. Basically, what really Gregory of Nyssa wants to say is that we do have a certain capacity in us given by God to participate in the divine life without ever being able to fully understand or fully exhaust or fully in any way permeate. It is the other way around. The permeation comes from God. We just participate in it by grace as much as we are allowed to as the creatures who God has created, and they're not divine by nature. So apophasis, the apophatic theology, is really, really very important feature. And it finds its most compelling expression in the writing of Pseudo-Dionysius and his corpus. The issue of the transcendence of God fueled the debate between Gregory Palamas and Barlaam, the Calabrian, in the 13th century, in the mid-14th century. And of course, the most important feature about this debate was, again, theosis. The feature of salvation, basically the teaching on the atonement, and really Eastern Orthodox understanding of salvation. But what is really theosis? In the most succinct summary, we will say that theosis is the growth of the believer united to Christ into the likeness of God through participation in God's energies, which are uncreated, eternal, and divine, really divinize man and yet do not abolish his humanity. What this really means is that we all participate in the divine life of God according to his own energies. Whether his energy is love, it is uncreated love. Whether his energy is wisdom, it is uncreated wisdom. So by that token, as we participate in the life of God, we basically participate in the reality of God's life without ever, again, coming close to what is called the essence of God. And therefore, the Eastern Orthodox theology has this kind of very distinct separation between what is God's essence and what are God's energies. So the theosis is based on three assumptions. The first is that the communion between God and man is real possibility and not just an analogy. The second is that man was created as an open being with the potential to go beyond his creaturely limits. And the third is that theosis is possible only on the basis of God's grace. At this point, we can summarize the logic of what Eastern Orthodox Church believes that Athanasius of Alexandria has really taught on theosis. They do believe that this teaching has been given in the kernel of in its basics by Athanasius of Alexandria and other great teachers of the 4th century, but the basic of that has been developed. But what are these in a nutshell? First, divinization or deification of creation after the fall begins with a union between the divine and human natures in Christ. Second, through the divinization of human nature, everyone who comes to Christ is being divinized by grace. And third, as a result of the first two instances of divinization, the divinization of the whole universe happens. Open quote. All three moments of theosis constitute the central part in the dogmatic system of St. Athanasius and occupy the most prominent place in the Greek patristic teaching on redemption. Close quote, according to John Meyendorff. Thus, the following definition of theosis. Theosis is assimilation to and union with God to the extent this is permitted. Participation in God in uniform perfection and in the one himself so far as this is permitted the satisfying intuition that nourishes intellectually whomever tends towards it, close quote. This is the definition given by the author of the Corpus of Pseudo-Dionysius. By the way, we really don't know who this person was. Perhaps lived in the late 5th, in the early 6th century, but he wants us to believe that he was the convert Dionysius of Apostle Paul when he preached on the Areopagus in the 1st century after Christ. A final observation is that the evangelical Christians should have in mind that we have a great deal of our Christian legacy in common with the Eastern Orthodox Church, and this should inform our assessment of its theology and our engagement with it. We all accept doctrines such as the two natures of Christ, the Trinity, and the substitutionary death of Christ. We share a commitment to biblical ethics and the preservation of traditional family values. Can we recognize each other as followers of Christ in the Spirit? Too often, the answer is no. This is usually due to ignorance on each side of the other's beliefs and practices. Openness is risky because it makes us ask difficult questions when the answers are not always straightforward or easy. But most of all, it requires spiritual maturity and discernment that goes beyond declarative adherence to a set of beliefs. Therefore, I hope that in the live communication that we're going to have after this lecture, we'll be able to talk more about some of these issues and ask about the relevance of how evangelical Christians can be more relevant in the context where Eastern Orthodox Christianity is the majority of society. But having said all of that, I hope that this is already a foundation and basis that will enable all those who want to participate in this lecture to explore further, and as evangelical Christians to see how they might be a faithful witness to Christ in the 21st century.
Hello to everyone. After we have heard from Kosta a basic outline of the main theological issues pertaining to the relationship between evangelicalism and Eastern Orthodox approach, it's my turn to help us think through some issues that have to do with ministering and witnessing in an Eastern Orthodox context. Let me introduce myself. My name is Yotis Kantartzis, and I am the pastor of the First Greek Evangelical Church, right in the middle of, in the center of Athens. So I have lived and ministered for most of my life in what we would call the Greek Orthodox context. So I would like to share with you a few insights that come to mind when I think what it means to have a contextual ministry in the Eastern Orthodox context. I think something which is very important for us to realize as evangelicals is that the Orthodox are not Catholics, are not Roman Catholics. One of the things that I came to realize is that most of the literature we read, even those of us who live in an Eastern Orthodox majority context, comes from other brothers and sisters from abroad, from United States, from United Kingdom, from other places. And when they talk about the distinctives of evangelicalism, they contrast that with Roman Catholicism. And many times we make the mistake to confuse the two. It is very important, therefore, to study afresh Eastern Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox approach. For example, at least in their theology, and of course that is something else which always we need to keep in mind, that there are two levels of theological thinking. One is the academic, so to say, the scholarly, the official, and the other is, the street level, if we can call it like that, what, people believe. And many times the two are not the same. But let's say at least in academic and dogmatic Eastern Orthodox theology, we are not saved by our good works. So there is a totally different approach than the Roman Catholic idea that through our good works we accumulate merit, and this is the way that one gets to be saved. I'm not going to elaborate more, but I'm just saying that to illustrate the point that we need to be careful and understand Eastern Orthodoxy on its and her own right. So that may be the first point, and building up to that is that we need to be fair and shy away from stereotypes. Many times, and we do that all the time. Everybody does that. It's very easy for us to have a caricature and tear it down. So, for example, as far as the icons, it is important that, again, in scholarly and dogmatic Eastern Orthodox theology, you never, ever paint in an icon God. So technically speaking, it's very inappropriate to call icons idols, in the sense that, okay, they represent God, or that they're breaking the 10 Commandments in that sense. Of course, there are exceptions, but again, I'm saying in the official dogmatic theology, you never paint God. Of course, you paint Jesus Christ. Why? To emphasize and underline the fact of the incarnation. But that's a totally different source. So it's very important to be fair and not attach stereotypes. Again, building up on that, we need to also affirm what is true. I think it is a mistake to feel like that we need to be anti-Orthodox in everything. There are many things, most of the things, perhaps very important things, that we share and we have in common. And I would say, and from my study of Eastern Orthodox theology, the main problems are not with what Eastern Orthodox theology affirms, but with what it denies. So, for example, there is a very strong emphasis on what we would call sanctification in the idea of the process of a journey, which, of course, as I said, we call it sanctification. Of course, what is missing from the Orthodox understanding is justification, is this thing that grounds everything. So, or another example, again, theologically speaking, the understanding of the cross. For the Orthodox theologians, the cross has to do primarily with the defeat of death. It's a victory. It's this model that Christ, in the cross, he defeated the evil powers, death and sin and all of that. Is that true? It is. But what is missing is this other aspect of forgiveness and expiation that is so important for us, the substitutionary understanding, even penal for, if you come from a Reformed persuasion, understanding of the cross. So again, what they affirm is not wrong, but is not enough. But it is important for us to affirm what is true and what is right, and not have an attitude that we need to be anti-Orthodox in all respects. Now, let me be more practical now. So, when we approach the question of ministering and even more witnessing in an Eastern Orthodox context, I think a very important missiological point is that we need to learn the language. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I have a very good friend who many times makes this comment. He says that what his church, he's Greek Orthodox, what his church is lacking is catechism. So people don't know what they believe, don't know what they do, they totally are lacking the sense of teaching. So if you're familiar with the practice of Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox. I guess I know for some countries, I don't want to assume that this is true for every context, but in most cases, the centerpiece of the life of the believer is the liturgy. In most cases, there is no sermon, there is no exposition of the Bible, even though the Bible is in the liturgical text. But again, if you are familiar with the way that the liturgy goes, it is sung and in an ancient language, so at least in Greece, most people don't understand a thing. The Bible is there, but they don't have ears to hear. So the whole point is the liturgy, and in most cases there is no sermon, and in some cases there is a sermon that you prefer that it didn't exist because it's a nationalistic and definitely, or moralistic, but definitely not biblical. So that is something that they're missing, and of course we have the sermon, the catechism, the teaching. On the other hand, he says that whenever I come to a Protestant context, what I am missing is the body and the gestures. So he says to me that when you enter Eastern Orthodoxy, you enter into a world full of gestures. You cross yourself, you bow and you kiss the icon, you smell, you touch, you taste, you see, you experience, and the body in a real way participates. And I think that this is something that it's a language that we need to learn somehow. I'm not saying that we need to mimic that language, but I say that we need to have our own version of this language as Protestants in order to make sense. For example, this same friend of mine, I remember once he was writing a paper for Bonhoeffer. A lot of Greek Orthodox people, they admire Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this German theologian. He called me late at night, really, so to say, worried, because he was reading something in German, and his German was not quite good as his French and English were. And he said, I read something here. He was reading about the community that Bonhoeffer created with young seminarians, and he said, I read here that they were celebrating the Lord's Supper once a month, and that cannot be true. And I said, well, it is. Most of us, at least I'm Presbyterian, I remember when I was young and growing up in my hometown, in my home church, we were celebrating the Lord's Supper 4 times a year, and then we did it every first Sunday of the month. And of course, we're not doing it during the months of July and August. Now, I don't want to get into denominational and doctrinal issues so much, but I think it is important for missiological reasons for us to think that, okay, what language do we talk when we invite someone to church? I still remember many years ago, a journalist wanted to write an article about our church, and he was quite fair and sympathetic, I would say. But it's very interesting the way he described his experience when he first entered into our sanctuary. He said it felt as if you were entering a lecture hall, and the professor, he said, now take out the book, turn to that page. Of course, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have at the center of our worship the word of the Lord. Obviously, for us Protestants, the church is the creation, the creature of the word, and we become church as we respond and as we listen to God's word, and that is very important. And we are thankful to the Lord that one of the benefits of the Reformation, of the gifts of the Reformation, is again the centrality of the sermon, which, by the way, if, for example, we have in mind Chrysostom or other fathers, 4th, 5th century, the sermon was, the biblical sermon was a very essential part of the life of the church. Now, what I want to say simply with all these stories is that we need to think what kind of language do we use in our worship services, and what do we communicate? Do we help them to see us as a church, or simply as a room where somebody talks and there is a lecture? I'm not saying that we need necessarily to move into one direction or another. I'm just saying that we need to think, okay, what is the body in our worship, since that is a very essential part of the language, the religious language, so to say, of the Eastern Orthodox. Now, let's think about evangelism and witness. Again, it is very important to keep in mind that in the Eastern Orthodox context, we cannot assume things that in many Western contexts people take for granted. Of course, due to secularization, that changes even in the West, but still there are those memories and those structures. So, for example, I remember several years ago, there was a Greek-American evangelist who came to Greece, and he wanted to do something similar to the Billy Graham Crusades. So we went to this big stadium, a good crowd was gathered, and I was there with my wife, and we brought together a friend of ours, a neighbor. She was a good lady. She would come to our church from time to time, so she was quite familiar with us and the gospel and all of that. So she went there with us, and as we were giving her a lift back, I asked her, how did you like it? What do you think about what you saw? And she said to me this. She said, okay, it was all right, but I felt really sorry for the guy, because at the end, he was he was asking something of us. And I felt really sorry for him, because I couldn't quite understand what he wanted us to do. What he was doing was he was extending a call similar to the way that Billy Graham would do it, meaning, have a music background and extending a call for people to come up. So this is a language that perhaps is well known it used to be known at least in United States, but it's a foreign language that, he wanted to say something, but in a language that people didn't understand. So what I'm saying is that we need to learn this language. I can talk more about that, but I will end with a final point. One of the main difficulties that we face as evangelicals in Eastern Orthodox majority countries is that we are seen as an imported foreign cult. And many times the way the identity that we have and the way that this identity plays out enforces and underlines this impression. There is a tendency among many evangelicals across the spectrum, which a name that we may use to describe it is retrieval. This idea that we need to reclaim Catholicity, not Roman Catholicism, but Catholicity, the sense that we belong to the Catholic Church, and we connect with the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and we claim and perhaps reclaim this tradition. I think that particularly for us, living in Eastern Orthodox contexts, that tendency, I think it's promising, at least, and it's something that we need to consider. That is to present ourselves not as a foreign, new, modern cult imported, but as part of a long tradition of the Catholic Church. Of course, we are Protestants, we have our unique identity, emphasizing unique things, but that we do that in the context of the one holy and Catholic Church. I hope these thoughts give food for thought. I don't have a recipe. I'm still searching for it, and I don't think that I will find it. But at least I think that gives us some parameters in order to think through issues which are practical for us who live, witness, minister in an Eastern Orthodox context. Thank you.